The Earth Hearth, a complete story. Part 1, Cast Out. Cumberland Gap, Tennessee, October 1917. The typhoid came fast. 10 days from first fever to final breath. That was all the time Temperance Sutherland had to watch her world collapse. Her father went first. Dr. Marcus Sutherland, geologist outsider. The man who talked to rocks and believed they talked back. The fever took him on a Tuesday morning, his last words a garbled mumble about thermal gradients and ancient stone. The town said it was fitting. A man who spent his life with his head in the clouds, dying without his feet on the ground. Her mother lasted 3 days longer. Eleanor Sutherland, born and raised in these mountains, the bridge between her husband's strange science and the town's straight-laced common sense. She fought the fever with the same quiet strength she'd used to defend her odd husband at church socials and town meetings. But typhoid doesn't care about strength or dignity or love. It just takes. Tempe was 15 years old. In the span of 10 days, she became an orphan. The funeral was sparsely attended. Thornwick Hollow didn't waste sentiment on a man who'd spent 20 years poking at rocks instead of clearing land or cutting timber like a proper man. They came for Eleanor because she'd been one of them. They tolerated the geologist's grave because it sat beside hers. Reverend Clayton spoke the words. The October wind stripped leaves from the oaks overhead, scattering them across the fresh-turned earth, like nature's own burial shroud. Tempe stood dry-eyed, her hands clasped in front of her simple black dress, a garment hastily altered from one of her mother's. She didn't cry. Crying was for later, for private moments, for when the world wasn't watching to see if Marcus Sutherland's daughter was as strange as her father. Across the grave, Aunt Opal watched her with eyes that calculated more than they mourned. Opal Sutherland was her father's younger sister, a woman carved from the same Tennessee limestone as the mountains themselves. Hard, weather-worn, practical to the point of coldness. She'd buried her own husband 5 years back, killed in a mill accident that left her with 2 young sons and a small cabin on the edge of town. She survived through careful rationing, meticulous planning, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that made sentiment a luxury she couldn't afford. After the burial, Opal approached. Her boys, 8 and 6, hung back near the cemetery gate, watching with the hollow-eyed wariness of children who'd learned early that life was scarce and mercy scarcer. "You'll come stay with us," Opal said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone one might use to announce rain or comment on the price of flour. Tempe nodded. There was nowhere else to go. The cabin Tempe had grown up in, the one her father had filled with books and rock specimens, and hand-drawn geological maps, was owned by the mill. Dr. Sutherland had rented it for 20 years, paying in occasional consulting work and coin when he had it. With him gone, the mill wanted it back. Silas Marlowe, who owned the mill and half the town besides, had given her 3 days to clear out. 3 days to pack up a life. Tempe worked in a fog of grief and mechanical efficiency. She sorted her parents' belongings into 3 piles, keep, sell, burn. The keep pile was small. A few of her mother's things. Her father's pocket watch, the silver case worn smooth from decades of handling. And the journals. Dr. Marcus Sutherland had kept meticulous records of his geological surveys. 20 leather-bound volumes filled with sketches of rock formations, notes on mineral deposits, measurements and calculations and theories about the ancient forces that had built these mountains. To most people in Thornwick Hollow, they were gibberish, crazy scribblings of a man who'd wasted his education on worthless stones. To Tempe, they were the sound of her father's voice. She packed them carefully in a canvas sack, along with a few other essentials. A small knife, a flint for starting fires, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, the pocket watch. She stood in the empty cabin on the third day, the October light slanting through bare windows, and said goodbye to the only home she'd ever known. Nobody came to help her carry her things. Nobody offered a wagon or a kind word. The town had done its duty by attending the funeral. The rest was her problem. She shouldered the sack and walked the 1.5 miles to Opal's cabin. The weight cut into her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking down in the middle of the road where anyone could see. Opal's cabin was smaller than the one Tempe had left. 2 rooms, a loft for sleeping, walls chinked with mud and moss that would need constant attention before winter. The stove was ancient, the kind that ate wood like a starving animal, and gave back heat grudgingly. Firewood was already stacked outside, a monument to Opal's relentless preparation. The first week wasn't terrible. Opal put her to work immediately, hauling water from the creek, helping with the endless process of preserving food for winter, mending clothes by candlelight while Opal's boys slept in the loft above. But Tempe noticed things. The way Opal measured out portions at meals, her eyes lingering on Tempe's plate. The way she counted the jars in the root cellar each evening, her lips moving in silent calculation. The way she looked at Tempe, sometimes not with warmth or family feeling, but with the cold assessment of a merchant evaluating inventory. By the third week, the calculations became words. "Winter's coming early this year," Opal said one evening. They were shelling beans, the repetitive work a rhythm that filled the silence. The signs are all there. Birds leaving too soon. Squirrels working overtime. Sky's got that look. Tempe nodded, not sure where this was going. "I've got 2 boys to feed, myself. The stores I've put up, they'll stretch for 3, maybe 4 if we're careful. But 5. Opal shook her head. 5 mouths through a hard winter. That's a calculation that doesn't work. The bean in Tempe's hand seemed suddenly very small, very fragile. "You're a good worker," Opal continued, her voice flat, carefully neutral. "Strong for your size, but you're also another mouth, another body to keep warm. Another person drawing from stores that are already spoken for." "I can work more," Tempe said quietly. "I can eat less." "You already eat less than you should. And there's only so much work to be done before the snow falls." Opal set down her bowl of shelled beans. "I'm not a cruel woman, Temperance, but I'm not a rich one either. I've got to think of my boys first. That's what mothers do. I'm family. You're your father's daughter. And your father, God rest him, never thought about winter until it was already here. Never planned, never prepared. Just trusted that rocks and theories would somehow feed a family." Opal's voice hardened. "I won't make that mistake. I can't afford to." The conversation ended there, but its conclusion hung in the air like smoke. 3 days later, Opal made it official. It was early November, the morning sharp with the promise of frost. Opal woke Tempe before dawn, told her to pack her things. When the sun rose, she stood on the porch of the cabin, arms crossed, and delivered her verdict with the same flat practicality she used for everything. I'm giving you 3 days. After that, you need to find somewhere else. Tempe stood in the yard, the canvas sack at her feet. Everything she owned in the world reduced to 30 pounds of cloth and leather and metal. The sun was coming up behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my decision to make. Opal's face was stone. Maybe Thornwick. Someone might take you on for kitchen work cleaning. Maybe farther south, where they don't know your father's reputation. But you can't stay here. I've got my boys to think about. There should have been anger. There should have been tears. Please, protests. But Tempe felt only a strange, cold clarity. This was the world her father had never quite understood. The world of careful calculations and ruthless survival. The world her mother had tried to shield them both from. I understand, she said, and she did. She didn't forgive it, but she understood it. Opal's face flickered something almost like guilt crossing it. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her father's pocket watch, the one Tempe thought she'd packed away. He'd want you to have this, Opal said, holding it out. And the journals. They're no use to me, but they were important to him. Maybe they'll be important to you. Tempe took the watch. The metal was cold in her palm, the weight of it familiar and strange all at once. She opened it. Inside, her father had inscribed a line in his careful, precise script. Time tells, but stone remembers. She closed it with a snap. Thank you, she said. The words tasted like ash, but she said them anyway. Opal nodded. Then she turned and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Not slammed, just closed. A ledger balanced, a calculation completed. Tempe stood in the yard as the sun climbed higher. Then she shouldered her sack and walked away from the last family she had in the world. The road through Thornwick Hollow was quiet in the early morning. Smoke rose from chimneys, the smell of breakfast fires and wood smoke heavy in the cold air. A few people were out heading to work or feeding animals. They saw her. Some nodded. Most didn't. Word had already spread the way word always spread in small towns. The Sutherland girl cast out. Another victim of her father's foolishness. She walked past the general store where Mr. Hayward was opening up for the day. Past the church where Reverend Clayton was sweeping the steps. Past the mill, the massive water wheel already turning, the sound of saws biting into timber. A constant backdrop to the town's life. And past Marlowe House. It sat on a small rise at the edge of town, the biggest house in Thornwick Hollow. 2 stories painted white with a wide porch, and actual glass in every window. Silas Marlowe had built it 10 years ago when the mill expanded, and his stove business took off. It was a statement. A declaration that in Thornwick Hollow, Silas Marlowe was the man who mattered. Tempe didn't plan to stop. She didn't plan to look. But as she passed the gate, someone called out, "Miss Sutherland." She turned. A girl stood on the porch, maybe 17, with dark hair braided and pinned, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Tempe's entire sack of belongings. Letty Marlowe, Silas's daughter. They'd known each other as children before the invisible lines of class and status had hardened into walls. Before Letty became the mill owner's daughter, and Tempe became the rock gazer's girl. "I heard about your aunt," Letty said, coming down the porch steps. Her voice was soft, careful. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She's doing what she has to do." "Where will you go?" Tempe adjusted the sack on her shoulder. "Somewhere." Letty glanced back at the house, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small cloth bundle and held it out. "Take this. It's not much. Just some biscuits and dried meat. But it's something." Pride said to refuse. Survival said to take it. Survival won. "Thank you," Tempe said, tucking the bundle into her sack. "If you need anything," Letty began. "I won't." Tempe cut her off, not unkindly. "But I appreciate the thought." She walked away before the conversation could continue, before kindness could turn into pity, before the weight of her situation could crack the careful shell she'd built around herself. The road led north toward the ridge, toward the wild country where the clearings thinned and the forest thickened, and the only people who went were hunters and hermits and fools. Tempe walked until Thornwick Hollow was behind her, until the sounds of the mill faded, until there was nothing but forest and mountain, and the cold wind coming down from the high country. Then, and only then, did she stop. She sat on a fallen log set, down her sack, and pulled out her father's journals. There were 20 of them, but one in particular she was looking for. The one from 15 years ago when her father first came to these mountains, before he met her mother, before he settled into the quiet defeat of a man whose ideas were too strange for the world he lived in. She found it. The leather cover was more cracked than the others, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, flipping through sketches of geological formations, notes on sediment layers, observations about water flow and mineral deposits. And then she found it, a crude map drawn in her father's precise hand. The landmarks were marked Split Oak Ridge, Triple Birch Stand, the Devil's Spine, a jagged rock formation that looked like vertebrae jutting from the mountain's back. And at the center of the map, circled in faded red ink, a single point. Beside it, her father had written, Thermopylae Point. Local legends speak of a place where the mountain breathes, warm air rising from stone even in winter. Investigated October 1902. Confirmed geothermal vent likely fed by deep aquifer heated by residual geological activity. Ancient peoples would have known such places. Modern settlers have forgotten. Below that, in smaller script, if I ever needed to survive a winter without shelter, this would be the place. The earth remembers warmth even when we forget how to listen. Tempe read the passage 3 times. Then she looked up at the ridge, at the wild country stretching north, at the impossible task her father's words suggested. She was 15 years old. She had a knife flint, a half loaf of bread, and a dead man's journals. Winter was coming, the kind of winter old-timers whispered about, the kind that killed the unprepared without mercy. She had 2 choices. Throw herself on the mercy of a town that had none to spare, work herself to exhaustion for scraps and a place to sleep in someone's barn, or trust her father's mad science, his belief that the earth itself could provide what human society would not. It wasn't really a choice at all. Tempe shouldered her sack and began walking north toward the ridge, toward the wild country, toward a point on a map marked by a dead man's hope. The search took 2 days. The map was old, and landmarks had a way of changing. Trees fell, rivers shifted, rock formations crumbled. What had been obvious to her father 15 years ago was obscure to her now. But she had his notes, his careful observations, and she had his training. From the time she could walk, he taught her to see the land differently, not as a surface to cross, but as a story to read. The split oak was easy enough to find, a massive white oak that had been struck by lightning sometime in the distant past, its trunk split clean down the middle, but still alive, still growing, both halves reaching for the sky like praying hands. Her father had sketched it perfectly. From there, she counted paces north, northwest, following a dry creek bed that would run heavy in spring, but was just a rocky scar in autumn. The triple birch stand took longer. Birch trees didn't live as long as oaks, and the cluster her father had marked might well be dead. But she found them or their descendants 3 white trunks growing so close together, they almost touched their papery bark peeling in the cold. The devil's spine was unmistakable, a ridge of black stone that thrust up through the forest floor, each vertebrae-like protrusion, taller than a man running for 30 yards, before disappearing back into the earth. Geologically, it was probably a dike, a vertical intrusion of harder rock that had resisted erosion better than the softer stone around it. To Tempe, it was a signpost. From the devil's spine, she followed her father's bearings. East by northeast, 200 paces to a cliff face of gray granite, streaked with white quartz. The cliff rose 20 feet, topped with scrub pine and mountain laurel, the kind of terrain that was easy to walk past and hard to remember. She almost missed it. The crack in the stone was barely visible, hidden behind a tangle of dead rhododendron, no wider than her hand at the base. Just another fissure in the rock, the kind the mountains were full of. Except for one thing. Tempe knelt, pushed aside the brittle rhododendron branches, and held her hand over the opening. At first, nothing. Just cold stone and colder air. Then, so faint she thought she might be imagining it, she felt it. Warmth. Not a gust, not wind, just a steady, gentle presence, a flow of air that was not cold. She pressed her palm closer to the opening. The warmth increased, subtle but undeniable. She held her hand there for a full minute, testing, confirming, hoping she wasn't deceiving herself with desperation. But it was real. The mountain was breathing and its breath was warm. Tempe sat back on her heels, her heart hammering. She pulled out her father's journal, read the entry again. Geothermal vent. Deep aquifer. Ancient peoples would have known. She looked at the crack in the stone, at the impossible promise it represented, and she made her decision. She would do what ancient peoples had done. She would build a home not on the earth, but in it. The next morning, she began to dig. Her tools were pathetic. The small knife her father had used for splitting rock samples. A flat piece of shale she'd broken from a nearby outcrop, sharp-edged enough to scrape and pry. Her hands. The work was brutal from the first hour. The crack widened slightly a few feet in, but it was packed tight, with centuries of decomposed rock soil and root systems from the plants above. Tempe worked on her knees, scraping away handfuls of dirt and stone, piling the debris to the side. Every few inches required what felt like hours of work. The shale shard broke after the first day. She found another and another. Her hands blistered, then bled, then formed calluses over the raw flesh. She worked from first light until dark, pausing only to eat sparingly from her dwindling supplies and drink from a nearby spring. At night, she slept at the entrance to her tunnel, wrapped in her mother's shawl, the gentle warmth of the vent keeping the worst of the cold at bay. It was that warmth that kept her going. Every inch she dug, the flow of warm air grew stronger. The temperature difference was subtle but real. Outside, the November nights were dropping into the 30s. Inside her shallow tunnel, it was 45, then 50 degrees. The math was simple. If she could dig deep enough, wide enough, the warmth would be enough to survive. By the end of the first week, she'd excavated perhaps 6 feet of tunnel, barely enough to crawl into. Her body was failing. Weight was dropping off her frame. Her muscles screamed with every movement. The knife was wearing down, the blade getting shorter with each day of use against stone. She was starting to understand why no one did this, why people built cabins and cut wood and relied on fire. This was madness. This was impossible labor for impossible results, but she kept digging. On the 8th day, she had a visitor. She was deep in the tunnel, scraping away at a stubborn root system, when she heard footsteps outside. She froze, listening. Then, slowly, she backed out of the tunnel into the gray November daylight. An old man stood there leaning on a walking stick, regarding her with eyes that had seen too many winters to count. He was tall and lean, his face weathered like old leather, his beard more white than gray. He wore buckskin and wool clothes that had been mended 100 times, and he carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. With the casual ease of someone who'd been carrying rifles since before Tempe was born, Ezra Boone, the hermit of the North Ridge, a man who'd walked away from Thornwick Hollow 30 years ago and never looked back. "You're Marcus Sutherland's girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Heard you were dead." "Not yet." Ezra grunted a sound that might have been approval or amusement. He walked closer, peered into the tunnel entrance, felt the warm air rising from it. A slow smile crossed his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned. He actually found it. You knew my father. Knew him hell. He showed me this place 15 years back. Tried to convince me to help him dig it out. Build something permanent. I told him he was crazy." Ezra shook his head. Maybe he was, but crazy don't mean wrong. He unslung a canvas bag from his shoulder and set it down. Inside were tools, a small pickaxe, a chisel well-worn but serviceable, a hammer. "Your pa lent me these 20 years ago when I was building my cabin. Told me to keep them, said he had no use for them anymore. Figured he'd given up on his rock dreams." Ezra nudged the bag toward her with his boot. "Reckon they're yours now. He'd want you to have them." Tempe stared at the tools, real tools, the kind that could actually move earth and stone. She looked up at the old man. "Why? Why what? Why help me? Why give me these?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Because 30 years ago I walked away from everything. Family, town, civilization. Folks call me crazy then too. But I'm still here, still alive, still free. Your father understood that. He didn't judge. He just listened. He met her eyes. Maybe you got some of that in you. Maybe you don't. But either way, you're trying something that takes guts. Figured I'd give you a fighting chance." He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Silas Marlowe runs this hollow with an iron fist. He don't take kindly to people doing things their own way. He hears about this, he'll come up here and tell you all the reasons you're wrong. All the reasons you should quit. All the dangers. Ezra smiled cold and knowing. Don't listen to him. He's built his whole life on selling fear and solutions to that fear. You're building a life that don't need what he's selling. That makes you dangerous. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest like smoke. Tempe looked at the tools, picked up the chisel, felt the weight of it, the balance. It was real. It was possible. She went back to digging. With proper tools, the work went faster. Not easy, but faster. The pickaxe could break through stubborn rock. The chisel could pry loose stones the shale couldn't budge. The hammer could drive the chisel deep. By the end of the second week, she'd extended the tunnel to 12 feet. She could crawl all the way in and turn around. The warm air was constant now. A steady 60-degree breath that never faltered. She learned the rhythm of the work. Dig in the morning when her strength was fresh. Forage in the afternoon, gathering the last of the nuts and berries, checking her snare lines for rabbits. Work again until dark. Sleep in the warm tunnel mouth, letting her battered body recover. Her hands developed thick calluses. Her shoulders and back grew sinewy with new muscle. The soft girl who'd walked away from Opal's cabin was disappearing, replaced by something harder, leaner, more focused. On the 14th day, Silas Marlowe found her. She was pulling debris from the tunnel. When she heard the horse, she scrambled out, her body tensed for trouble. Marlowe sat his horse like a man who was born to command, tall and broad-shouldered. His face carved from the same granite as the mountains. He was 45 and looked it. His dark hair shot through with gray. His eyes the color of winter sky. He dismounted, tied his horse to a tree, and walked over to inspect her work. "Miss Sutherland," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Mr. Marlowe." He crouched by the tunnel entrance, felt the warm air, examined the pile of excavated stone and earth. His expression was unreadable. "What exactly are you doing here?" "Building a home. In a hole in the ground." "In the earth, yes." Marlowe stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "I heard rumors. The Boone hermit was in town, trading pelts, mentioned seeing Marcus Sutherland's daughter, digging on the North Ridge. I thought he was drunk or senile. But here you are. Here I am. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" Marlowe's voice was patient, almost gentle, like a teacher explaining basic facts to a slow student. "Cave-ins, flooding, unstable rock. That warm air you're feeling, that's cave damp. It'll rot your lungs from the inside. Come spring, the first heavy rain will flood this hole, and you'll drown in your sleep. My father studied this formation for years. He documented it, measured it, understood it. This isn't a cave. It's a geothermal vent. Your father was a dreamer." Marlowe said it without malice, just stating fact. A good man, an educated man, but a dreamer. Dreams don't keep you warm in January. Dreams don't keep you alive when the temperature drops to 10 below, and the wind is trying to claw through every crack. He gestured to his horse, to the saddlebags bulging with supplies. "I came up here to offer you something practical. I need someone at the mill to help in the kitchen." keep the boarding house clean for the lumber crews. It's honest work, steady pay, and you'd have a warm place to sleep and 3 meals a day. You're young, you're strong, you can read and write. That's more than most. You could build a real future, not waste away in a hole in the ground. It was a good offer. A generous offer. The kind of offer that sensible people accepted. Tempe looked at the tunnel she'd been digging for 2 weeks. Looked at her bloody, calloused hands. Looked at Silas Marlowe, at the certainty in his eyes, the absolute conviction that he knew better. No. Marlowe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or the first hint of irritation. No. No, thank you. I appreciate the offer, but I'm staying here. Miss Sutherland, my father wasn't just a dreamer, Mr. Marlowe. He was a scientist. He understood things about these mountains that nobody else bothered to learn. And he was right about this place. I can feel it. The warmth is real. The science is sound. I'm gonna finish what he started. Marlowe was quiet for a long moment, studying her. Then his face changed, hardening in a way that wasn't quite anger, but something deeper, older. I learned about dreams and science the hard way, Miss Sutherland. His voice dropped, losing its patient tone. 20 years ago, my younger brother went to work in a copper mine up in Virginia. New operation. They brought in some engineer from back east with all kinds of scientific theories about shaft reinforcement. New techniques, he said. More efficient, he said. Mathematical calculations proved it was safe. Marlowe's jaw tightened. Thomas died screaming under 100 tons of rock because some educated fool thought he knew better than generations of miners. They found his body 3 days later, crushed so badly we buried him in a box the size of a seed sack. He stepped closer, and Tempe could see the old pain in his eyes calcified into bitter certainty. Your father was cut from the same cloth. Book smart, theory obsessed, full of ideas about how the world worked, based on what he read in books, instead of what he learned from living in it. And just as dangerous. Marlowe's voice was quiet now, but hard as the stone around them. I won't watch another person die chasing dreams in the earth. I won't stand by while Marcus Sutherland's theories kill his daughter, the way that engineers' theories killed my brother. The silence stretched between them. Tempe felt the weight of his grief, his fear, his certainty, born from tragedy. And she understood in that moment that his opposition wasn't cruelty. It was protection. Misguided, perhaps, but rooted in loss. I'm sorry about your brother, she said quietly. But my father's work isn't theory. It's observation, measurement. Understanding what's already here, not imposing new methods on old Earth. That's what they all say, right up until the ground gives way. He gestured again to his horse, his offer. I'm trying to help you, Temperance. I'm trying to save you from making the same mistakes. Dreams are fine for men with money and time to waste. But you're a 15-year-old girl alone in the wilderness with winter coming. You need practical help, not geological theories. What I need, Tempe said, her voice steady, is to be left alone to do my work. Marlowe's patience finally cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes went cold. Fine. Have it your way. But when the first snow comes, when the cold settles in and that hole you're digging becomes your grave, don't come crying to Thornwick Hollow. We warned you. I warned you. This is on your head. He mounted his horse, gathered the reins. Your father was a good man, but his head was full of notions about rocks and theories. You're following in his footsteps straight into the ground. And I'll be damned if I can stop you. He rode away without looking back, disappearing down the trail toward town. Tempe stood there, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with suppressed fury and fear and determination all mixed together. Because part of her, the small, scared part, knew he might be right. Knew that she might be throwing her life away on a mad dream. But the other part, the part that sounded like her father's voice reading from his journals, the part that felt the warm air rising from the stone, that part knew something else. The earth remembers, even when we forget how to listen. She went back to digging. The days blurred together. Dig, forage, sleep. Repeat. The tunnel grew longer, deeper. 15 feet. 18. 20. The work was destroying her body and rebuilding it stronger. She could feel the change in her muscles, in the way she moved, in her endurance. But supplies were running low. The last of the bread was gone. The dried meat from Letty was finished. She was surviving on nuts, the occasional rabbit from her snares, and water from the spring. Her body was burning through fat reserves she didn't have. On the 20th day, she found something waiting at the tunnel entrance when she emerged in the morning. A small cloth sack carefully placed on a flat stone. Inside, dried venison, hardtack biscuits, a small jar of honey, and a folded piece of paper. The note was written in careful script. Don't stop. Some of us believe. L.M. Letty Marlowe. Tempe stared at the note, at the food, at this small act of rebellion from a girl who had everything to lose and nothing to gain. She ate one of the biscuits, slowly making it last, tasting not just the food, but the kindness behind it. Then she went back to work. By the end of the 3rd week, the tunnel was 25 feet deep and widening into what would become her main chamber. The warm air was constant now, a steady 65 degrees, even as the outside temperature dropped into the 20s at night. She could feel the heat in the stone itself, could sense the vast thermal mass of the mountain, slowly absorbing and redistributing the earth's deep warmth. Her father had been right. Completely, utterly right. But being right didn't make the work easier. It didn't fill her stomach or heal her exhausted body. It didn't protect her from the creeping doubt that set in during the dark hours before dawn, when the enormity of what she was attempting felt crushing. She was so tired, so hungry, so alone. On the 21st day, she nearly quit. She was working deep in the tunnel when the ceiling section above her groaned. She had maybe 2 seconds of warning before a section of rock the size of a wagon wheel came down. She threw herself backward, felt the impact of stone on stone, felt the rush of air as the ceiling collapsed into the space where she'd been kneeling. Dust filled the tunnel, choking, blinding. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping on stone, her breath coming in panicked gasps. When the dust settled, she could see that a section of the tunnel had partially collapsed, blocking her way forward. Not completely, but enough. Enough to undo days of work. Enough to remind her just how fragile this whole enterprise was. She crawled out of the tunnel, sat in the cold November morning, and finally let herself cry. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded. crying for her dead parents, for her lost home, for the impossible task she'd set herself, for the bone-deep exhaustion and hunger and loneliness. She cried until she had no tears left. Then she sat there, numb, staring at nothing. The sun climbed higher. Birds called in the forest. The world continued indifferent to one girl's crisis. After a long time, Tempe stood up. She wiped her face with her dirty sleeve. She picked up her tools, and she went back into the tunnel to clear the collapse. Because what else was there to do? Go back to Thornwick Hollow. Beg for Marlowe's charity. Prove everyone right about her father's foolishness. Live out her days cleaning other people's houses, sleeping in other people's barns, existing on the margins of a society that had no use for dreamers. No, she would finish this, or she would die trying. The collapse took 2 days to clear. Exhausting, dangerous work, constantly aware that the ceiling could come down again at any moment. But she learned from it, started using small pieces of wood to shore up unstable sections, learned to read the rock to see the subtle signs of weakness. By November's end, the main chamber was taking shape. 10 feet in diameter, 7 feet high at the center, the walls and ceiling carefully reinforced. The warm air flowed constantly from the vent at the back, and the thermal mass of the surrounding stone was doing exactly what her father's calculations said it would. The temperature inside was holding steady at 65 degrees, even as outside temperatures dropped into the teens. She'd done it. Almost. There was still work to be done. A sleeping niche to carve out. A small oven to build for cooking. The entrance to properly seal. But the hard part, the impossible part, was finished. She had built a home in the earth. That night she slept in her chamber for the first time. No blankets, no fire, just the warm stone around her, and the gentle, constant breath of the mountain. For the first time in weeks, she slept through the night without waking. The next morning, she crawled out to find another visitor waiting. Letty Marlowe stood by the entrance, a larger sack at her feet. She looked nervous, glancing back down the trail as if expecting to be caught. "I can't stay," she said quickly. "Father doesn't know I'm here. But I wanted to see it, to see if you'd really done it." Tempe gestured to the entrance. "Want to look?" Letty hesitated, then nodded. She knelt and peered into the tunnel. Tempe watched as the girl's expression changed from skepticism to confusion to wonder. "It's warm," Letty breathed. "It's actually warm. How?" "My father's science. The earth's heat rising through stone. Thermal mass. Geothermal venting. It's all in his journals." Letty pulled back, staring at Tempe with new eyes. "Father said you were digging your grave. Everyone in town thinks you're either dead or mad." "Maybe both." Tempe allowed herself a small smile. Letty didn't smile back. "Father forbade me from coming here. He said you were a bad influence. Said you were wasting your life on foolish dreams. If he finds out I've been bringing you food, helping you, then don't let him find out. It's not that simple. He's not a bad man, Temperance. He's just certain, I know. I've met him." Letty nodded, looking miserable. "I brought more supplies. It's not much, but it should help. Just please be careful. Winter's coming hard this year. Everyone's saying it. The old-timers are scared." I'll be fine. Will you? Letty's voice was sharp with genuine concern. You're skin and bones. You're alone. You're living in a hole in the ground. How is that fine? Tempe touched the warm stone of the tunnel entrance. Because I'm warm. Because I'm safe. Because I proved everyone wrong. Proving people wrong doesn't keep you alive. No. But it's a start. Letty shook her head, but she was smiling despite herself. You're as stubborn as your father was. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. I'm taking it as one anyway. Letty left, and Tempe carried the supplies into her chamber. More food, some candles, a few pieces of cloth, small things that made an enormous difference. And tucked at the bottom of the sack, another note. Keep digging. Tempe smiled. Then she got to work on the finishing touches. December arrived with a cold that had teeth. The old-timers in Thornwick Hollow looked at the sky and shook their heads. This wasn't normal winter. This was something else. Something darker, colder, more dangerous. The birds had fled weeks early. The squirrels were working frantically. The sky had taken on a bruised yellowish tint that old men recognized from stories their grandfathers had told. A hard winter was coming, maybe the hardest in a generation. In Thornwick Hollow, families doubled their wood cutting. Silas Marlowe's stove business boomed. People bought extra supplies, sealed their cabins, prepared for a siege. On the North Ridge, Temperance Sutherland put the final touches on her earth hearth. She built a small clay oven near the entrance using mud from a nearby creek bed and flat stones. She created a smoke vent that would pull the smoke outside using the natural draft. She fashioned a door from deer hides she'd tanned herself, treating them with animal fat to make them wind and water resistant. She carved a sleeping niche into the wall, lined it with pine boughs. She dug a small pantry niche, stocked it with her meager supplies. On December 8th, she sealed herself inside. The temperature outside was 25 degrees and dropping. Inside her earth hearth, it was 65 and steady. She sat in the warm darkness, lit a single candle, and opened her father's journal to the last page. In the margin, in her own hand, she wrote, Day 63. The earth hearth is complete. You were right, Papa. About everything. The mountain does remember warmth. I just had to listen. T.S. She closed the journal, blew out the candle, and lay down in her sleeping niche. The stone was warm beneath her. The air was still and gentle. There was no wind, no cold, no fear. Just peace. For the first time since her parents died, Temperance Sutherland felt something that might have been hope. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Part 2. The Proving Ground. The snow came on December 9th, light and tentative like a scout testing enemy territory. It didn't stick. By noon, it had stopped leaving the forest damp and the sky the color of old bruises. But Tempe knew what it meant. The storm was coming. The real storm. The one the old-timers whispered about. She stood at the entrance to her earth hearth looking out at the gray world and felt a strange calm. Let it come. She was ready. Inside her chamber, the temperature held steady. The clay oven she'd built worked perfectly, drawing smoke out through the vent she'd engineered, leaving the air inside clean and warm. She had enough firewood for cooking enough food for perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. Water from the spring which she could collect even in snow. And most importantly, she had warmth. Constant, reliable, endless warmth. The stone walls radiated heat like a gentle embrace. The floor was warm enough to walk on barefoot. There were no drafts, no cold spots, no desperate huddling around a single source of heat while the rest of your body froze. She had built a miracle. A small one, perhaps. A humble one. But a miracle nonetheless. That night she slept deeply, the sleep of someone who had labored to the point of collapse and found rest on the other side. She didn't know that 8 miles away in Thornwick Hollow, Silas Marlowe was standing in his yard, looking at that same bruised sky and feeling the first whisper of real fear. The next day brought more snow. Heavier this time. It fell in thick, wet flakes that accumulated fast, covering the ground in a blanket of white that muffled sound and changed the shape of the world. Tempe spent the morning checking her supplies, organizing her small space, making sure everything was secure. She ventured out once to collect water and check the snare lines she'd set. Nothing. The animals had already gone to ground, sensing what was coming. She retreated to her chamber, sealed the high door, and waited. The temperature outside dropped through the afternoon. By evening, it was in the teens and still falling. Inside, the earth hearth held at 64 degrees. Tempe sat in the warm darkness, a single candle burning, and read her father's journals. Not for information anymore, but for comfort. The familiar scratch of his handwriting, the careful diagrams, the passionate observations about stone and earth, and the deep, patient forces that shaped mountains. She could almost hear his voice. The earth doesn't hurry temperance. It doesn't panic. It simply exists, constant and reliable, while we scurry across its surface like mayflies. If you want to survive, you learn to think in earth time, to trust in stone. She fell asleep with the journal open on her chest. Her father's words the last thing in her mind. December 11th dawned clear and bitterly cold. The sky was a hard, bright blue, the kind of blue that promised no mercy. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees overnight, and the wind had picked up a steady keening that found every crack and crevice in the forest. Tempe crawled out of her chamber to assess the world. The snow was 6 inches deep and crusted with ice. The trees stood stark and black against the white ground. Her breath plumed in clouds that froze almost instantly. She collected water quickly, her hands going numb in seconds despite the rags she'd wrapped them in. Back inside, she sealed the entrance and pressed her palm against the stone wall. Still warm, still constant. She allowed herself a small smile. 8 miles away in Thornwick Hollow, the mood was very different. Silas Marlowe stood in his parlor, watching his crew stack firewood. They'd been at it for 3 days, piling split oak and hickory and cords along the side of the house. The pile was impressive, a monument to preparation and hard work. But looking at it now, with the temperature plummeting and the sky that ominous blue, Silas felt a creeping doubt. Was it enough? His wife, Cordelia, came to stand beside him. She was a handsome woman, tall and strong, with dark hair, threaded with silver, and eyes that missed nothing. They'd been married 20 years, raised 2 children, built a life together. She knew him better than anyone. "You're worried," she said. Not a question. "The signs are bad, worse than I've seen." We've prepared, we always prepare. I know, but this feels different. He gestured to the woodpile. What if it's not enough? What if this winter is harder than we think? Cordelia put her hand on his arm. Then we'll manage. We always do. We're not like those fools who wait until the first snow to start thinking about survival. We plan, we prepare, we endure. Silas nodded, but the doubt remained. He thought about the Sutherland girl up on the ridge in her hole in the ground. By now, she was probably dead, frozen solid or starved or crushed under a collapse. He'd tried to help her. He'd offered her a way out. She'd refused. That was on her. Still, the thought sat uneasily in his mind. The memory of his brother's death, the way certainty had killed Thomas as surely as falling rock, the way the Sutherland girl had looked at him with those steady eyes and said his father's work was observation, not theory. What if she was right? No, impossible. He'd seen too many winters, built too many houses, sold too many stoves. He knew what worked, what kept people alive. His son Nathaniel came in from outside, his cheeks red with cold, his breath steaming. That's the last of it, Pa. The woodshed's full and we've got 3 cords stacked by the house. Good boy. Silas ruffled his son's hair. Nate was 11, sturdy and sensible, with his mother's dark hair and his father's practical nature. Go warm up by the stove. Tell your sister to start supper. The boy ran off and Silas turned back to the window. The sun was setting early the way it did in December, painting the snow in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if they hadn't felt so ominous. It's gonna be bad, he said quietly. Cordelia didn't argue. She'd seen the signs, too. That night, the wind picked up. It came from the north, screaming down from the high country, bringing with it a cold that felt alive and malicious. It found every gap in the cabin's chinking, every tiny space around windows and doors, and it pushed through with fingers of ice. The Marlowe family huddled around their cast-iron stove, which roared and crackled with a full load of oak. The heat was intense near the stove, almost painful. But move 10 feet away and the cold reclaimed you. The floor was freezing. The walls were cold to the touch. Frost formed on the inside of the windows. Silas fed the stove, constantly opening the iron door to shove in another log, another. The wood pile outside was shrinking visibly. Cordelia wrapped the children in every blanket they owned. Letty, 17 and sensible, sat close to her younger brother, keeping him warm with her own body heat. Nate huddled against her, shivering despite the layers. How long will it last? Letty asked. Hard to say, Silas answered, feeding the stove again. Could be a few days, could be longer. We have enough wood, don't we? Silas didn't answer immediately. He was doing the math in his head, calculating consumption against supply, and the numbers weren't as comfortable as he wanted them to be. We have enough, he said finally, if we're careful. But that night, lying in bed with Cordelia, the stove's roar a constant backdrop, he whispered the truth. We're burning through wood too fast. At this rate, we'll run out in a week, maybe less. Then we'll burn less. Keep the fire lower. Any lower and the children will freeze. They lay in silence, listening to the wind scream and the stove roar its defiance. On the ridge in her earth hearth, Temperance Sutherland slept peacefully. December 12th arrived with violence. The storm hit just after dawn, a wall of white that descended from the north like the wrath of an angry god. The snow didn't fall. It drove sideways, pushed by winds that screamed at 40 miles an hour. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plummeted to 10 below zero. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic blizzard. Tempe woke to the sound of the wind howling outside her chamber. For a moment, disoriented in the darkness, she felt a spike of fear. Then she remembered where she was. She lit a candle with hands that didn't shake, and the warm glow pushed back the darkness. The temperature inside was 63 degrees. The wind couldn't reach her here. The cold couldn't touch her. She was safe. She spent the day in quiet routine. A small meal of dried meat and hardtack. Water from the jug she'd filled the day before. Reading her father's journals. Tending the small fire in her clay oven. Cooking a thin soup from roots and rabbit meat. The hours passed peacefully. There was nothing to do but wait. And waiting in warmth was easy. Outside, the world was ending. In Thornwick Hollow, the storm was a siege. Snow piled against doors and windows. Drifts formed 10 feet high in the space of hours. The wind found every weakness in every cabin, every barn, every structure, and exploited it mercilessly. The Marlowe house, the finest in the hollow, the most carefully built, was suffering. Silas fed the stove in a constant rhythm. Load, close door, wait 30 minutes, load again. The woodpile was disappearing faster than he'd calculated. Much faster. The stove was a tyrant. It demanded tribute, constantly consuming split oak like a starving animal. And even with that constant feeding, the cabin was losing the battle. The heat rose to the ceiling and pooled there uselessly. The floor was a sheet of ice. The children shivered despite being wrapped in every piece of fabric the family owned. Cordelia tried to keep spirits up, but Silas could see the fear in her eyes. She was doing the same math he was. They had perhaps 4 days of wood left, maybe 5 if they rationed carefully. The storm showed no signs of stopping. On the second day, a section of chinking between the logs cracked and fell out, creating a gap the width of a finger. The wind found it immediately, driving a needle of Arctic air into the cabin's main room. Silas stuffed the gap with rags and clay, but it was a temporary fix. The cold was winning. The cabin that had seemed so solid, so permanent, was revealing itself to be what it really was, a fragile shell, a desperate human attempt to hold back the infinite cold. By the 3rd day, the wood pile was half gone, and the storm was still raging. Nate started coughing. It began as a small thing, a dry tickle that made him clear his throat. But by evening, it had deepened into a wet, rattling sound that Cordelia recognized with dread. "It's the cold," she said, putting her hand on the boy's forehead. "He's not feverish yet, but if he keeps breathing this frigid air, I know." Silas's voice was tight. He knew exactly what she was saying. Lung fever, pneumonia. The winter killer that took more children than accidents or illness or anything else. We need to keep him warmer. There is no warmer. Not unless we burn the furniture. They stared at each other. And in that moment, Silas Marlowe felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Helplessness. He'd built the best house in the hollow. He'd prepared better than anyone. He'd stockpiled wood and food and supplies. He'd done everything right. And it wasn't enough. The 4th day of the storm brought no relief. If anything, the wind intensified, shrieking like a living thing, piling snow into drifts that buried the lower windows. The world outside was pure white chaos. Inside the Marlowe cabin, Nate's cough had worsened. The boy's breathing was labored, each inhalation followed by a wet, rattling exhalation that tore at Cordelia's heart. His fever had spiked in the night, climbing to 104 degrees. Cordelia sat beside him, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering prayers and reassurances she didn't believe herself. Letty huddled nearby, her own face, pale with cold and fear. "Is he going to be all right?" Cordelia didn't answer. She couldn't lie to her daughter, and she couldn't tell the truth. Silas stood by the stove, feeding it the last of their reserve wood. Tomorrow they would have to start breaking up furniture. After that, maybe the walls themselves. He'd built his life on certainty, on planning and preparation, and the conviction that hard work and foresight could overcome any obstacle. He'd sold that certainty to others in the form of stoves and lumber, and the promise that civilization could triumph over wilderness. And now his son was dying in the best house in the hollow, and all his certainty was revealed as the lie it had always been. He thought about Thomas, about the mine collapse, about the engineer's confident calculations and the reality of crushed bone and screaming darkness, about how certainty killed just as surely as ignorance. And he thought about the Sutherland girl, about her quiet insistence that her father's work was different, about the warm air rising from stone, about the possibility, however remote, that he'd been wrong. On the 5th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died. The snow stopped. The sky cleared to a hard, bright blue that hurt to look at. The temperature was -15 degrees. Silas stood in his yard looking at what the storm had left behind. Snow everywhere drifted 10 feet high, in places the world transformed into an alien landscape of white and blue and shadow. The trees were coated in ice, their branches hanging low under the weight. Every sound was muffled, deadened. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Behind him in the cabin, Nate's breathing was getting worse. The boy was barely conscious, his fever raging his small body, shaking with chills even though he was wrapped in every blanket they owned. Cordelia's face was drawn and gray. "The fever's not breaking. It's getting worse." "I know. He needs a doctor. The doctor's 8 miles away and the snow's too deep. Nobody can get through." "Then what do we do?" Her voice cracked. "Just watch him die." Silas had no answer. He stood there, this man who always had answers, who always had a plan, and he had nothing. Then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Standing on a ridge, a crack in the stone, warm air rising. The Sutherland girl looking at him with those steady eyes. My father wasn't just a dreamer. He was a scientist. He dismissed it, called it foolishness, called it a grave, told her she was following her father into the ground. But what if he'd been wrong? What if his certainty, like that, engineer's certainty, like all the certainties he'd built his life on, was just another form of blindness? It was a desperate thought, a mad thought. The girl was probably dead. And even if she wasn't, even if by some miracle she'd survived in that hole, what could she possibly do for his son? that he couldn't. But desperation has a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. Silas looked at the ridge barely visible through the trees and snow, maybe a mile away as the crow flies, 2 miles through the drifts. He thought about his son dying in the best house in the hollow. He thought about his certainty, his pride, his conviction that he knew better. He thought about Thomas screaming under rock, and he made a decision. "I'm going to the ridge," he said. Cordelia stared at him. "What?" "The Sutherland girl. If she's alive, if that place she built actually works. Silas, she's dead. She has to be." "Probably, but what if she's not? You can't carry Nate through that. He'll freeze before you get halfway. Then I'll freeze with him. Because if I stay here, I watch him die for certain. At least this way there's a chance." He didn't wait for her response. He went inside, bundled Nate in every piece of warm clothing they had, wrapped him in blankets, and lifted the boy in his arms. Nate was small for 11, but he was still heavy. Dead weight, fever slack. Letty grabbed his arm. "Papa, don't. Please. It's too far. Too cold." "Watch your mother," was all he said. Cordelia stood in the doorway, tears frozen on her cheeks. "If you're wrong, I know. If she's dead, I know. Silas, I have to try." He stepped out into the Arctic wasteland and began to walk. The journey was hell. The snow was waist-deep in places, chest-deep where it had drifted. Every step required enormous effort, plunging a leg down through the crust, finding solid ground, pulling the other leg forward, all while carrying a sick child and feeling the cold trying to kill them both. The temperature was so low it burned. Silas's breath froze in his beard almost instantly, forming a solid mask of ice around his mouth and nose. His hands, even wrapped in layers of wool, were going numb. His feet were blocks of ice in his boots, and Nate was getting heavier with every step. Twice Silas fell, plunging face first into the snow, barely managing to twist his body to protect his son. Getting up again was agony. Every muscle screamed. His lungs felt like they were being scraped with razors. He wanted to quit, wanted to lie down in the snow and let the cold take them both. It would be easier, faster. But he didn't. He thought about all the times he'd told people how to prepare for winter, all the lectures he'd given about proper planning and sensible precautions, all the certainty he'd sold along with his stoves and his lumber, all the times he dismissed Marcus Sutherland's ideas as foolish dreams, all the times he'd let his own grief over Thomas harden into rigid certainty. He pushed forward. The landmarks were barely recognizable under the snow, but he'd hunted these ridges for 30 years. He knew them in his bones. The split oak was buried to its lower branches. The triple birch were white ghosts against white ground. The devil's spine was a series of black protrusions breaking through the snow like the earth's own gravestones. He was close. The sun was getting low. The temperature was still dropping. Nate's breathing had become so shallow, Silas kept checking to make sure the boy was still alive. And then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a desperate hallucination born of hypothermia and hope. But he blinked, squinted, kept walking, and it remained. A patch of bare ground, in the middle of the vast white wasteland, a circle of earth perhaps 20 feet across, where the snow had melted. And rising from its center, a thin plume of vapor, like breath on a cold morning. Silas's legs nearly gave out. Not from exhaustion, though he was beyond exhausted, but from the sheer impossible reality of what he was seeing. She'd done it. Against all reason, against all odds, the girl had actually done it. He stumbled forward, fell to his knees at the edge of the bare ground. The earth was warm beneath his hands. Warm. In the middle of negative 15-degree weather, the ground was warm to the touch. The entrance to the earth hearth was right where he remembered, partially concealed behind frozen rhododendron. The deer hide covering it was stiff with cold on the outside, but he could feel heat radiating from beneath it. With shaking hands, he pushed the hide aside. Warmth hit him like a physical force. Humid, gentle, impossible warmth. The smell of earth and baking bread and life. He blinked his eyes, struggling to adjust from the blinding white glare to the soft darkness within. And then he saw her. Temperance Sutherland sat near a small clay oven, tending a pot of something that smelled of herbs and meat. She was wearing a simple dress, her feet bare on the stone floor. Her hair was pulled back, her face calm and healthy, her movements easy and relaxed. She looked up at him, and there was no surprise in her eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement as if she'd been expecting him all along. "Mr. Marlowe," she said, "you should bring your son inside. It's warmer." Silas Marlowe, who had answers for everything, who had spent 45 years building certainty, could only stare. His entire understanding of the world, every principle he'd built his life on, was crumbling like rotten wood. The girl he'd called a fool was sitting in comfortable warmth while his son died in the best house he could build. She'd been right about everything, and he'd been wrong. Tempe stood, wiped her hands on her dress, and walked over to him. She knelt, looked at Nate's flushed, fever-bright face, touched his forehead with a practiced hand. "Lung fever," she said. Not a question. Silas nodded, unable to speak. "Bring him here." She led him deeper into the chamber. Silas followed in a daze, still carrying his son, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. The smooth stone walls, the steady enveloping warmth, the simple efficiency of the space. At the back of the chamber, where the warm air flowed strongest from some invisible source in the rock, Tempe had created a sleeping niche lined with soft pine boughs. She gestured to it. "Lay him there. The warmth is strongest here. The humidity will help his breathing." Silas did as he was told, moving like a man in a dream. He laid Nate down, gently unwrapped some of the blankets since the warmth made them unnecessary. The boy's breathing was still labored, still rattling. But even in his fever haze, he seemed to relax slightly in the gentle heat. Tempe brought a wooden cup of water, held it to Nate's lips. The boy drank without fully waking. Then she looked at Silas, and in her eyes was something he'd never seen directed at him before. Pity. "You should sit," she said. "You're half frozen." Only then did Silas realize he was shaking violently, his entire body convulsing with cold. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His hands and feet were numb. He'd been so focused on getting here, on saving his son, that he hadn't noticed he was dying himself. Tempe helped him to a spot near her oven where a thin blanket was spread on the warm stone floor. She brought him water, then a small piece of flatbread, still warm from cooking. "Eat slowly," she said. "Your body's in shock." He obeyed, chewing mechanically, the simple bread tasting better than any meal he could remember. As the warmth seeped into his bones, as feeling returned to his extremities in painful waves, he began to understand the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a complete inversion of everything he knew about surviving winter. His house fought the cold with violent heat from a hungry stove. This place simply stepped aside from the cold, entirely using the earth's own patient warmth as both structure and source. His house was a war. This was a peace treaty. He looked at the girl, this 15-year-old orphan he'd dismissed as a fool, and tried to find words. How? He finally managed. Tempe looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked over to where her father's journals were stacked, selected one and brought it back. She opened it to a page covered in diagrams and calculations. "Your stove shouts to keep the cold out," she said quietly. "My hearth tells a story to invite the warmth in." She showed him the drawings, explained about thermal mass and R values and geothermal gradients, showed him how the constant flow of warm air from the vent heated not just the air in the chamber, but the stone itself, creating a massive battery of stored heat that radiated constantly. Showed him how his entire approach to winter survival was fundamentally inefficient. Silas listened, and with every word, every diagram, every quiet explanation, he felt the foundations of his certainty cracking further. He'd been wrong about Marcus Sutherland, about his daughter, about the nature of warmth and cold and survival itself. He'd called this girl a fool while she built something that actually worked, while he built houses that looked impressive and failed when they were needed most. The shame of it was crushing. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Tempe looked at him, and there was no triumph in her eyes, no vindication, just tired compassion. "Your son needs rest and warmth. You need the same. Everything else can wait." And so for 3 days, Silas Marlowe lived in the earth hearth with the girl he'd tried to save, while she saved his son instead. He watched as Nate's breathing slowly eased, watched the fever break on the second day, the boy's skin cooling, his sleep becoming natural instead of fever delirium. He watched Tempe tend the clay oven, cook simple meals with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make much from little. Watched her check the entrance, maintain the space, move through her routine with quiet competence. And he learned that warmth wasn't something you fought for with fire and fuel. It was something you could borrow from the earth itself if you were humble enough to listen. Learned that his father's generation and his grandfather's had known things that his generation had forgotten in the rush to build and sell and civilize. Learned that sometimes the old ways, the quiet ways, the ways that looked like foolishness to modern eyes were actually profound wisdom, waiting to be rediscovered. Learned that his certainty about the Sutherland girl had been as misguided as that engineer's certainty about mine shafts. That grief could calcify into rigid thinking just as easily as pride could. On the 3rd day, Nate woke up fully. His fever was gone. His breathing was clear. He looked around the warm chamber with wide eyes and asked, "Where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Silas answered. "Thanks to Miss Sutherland." The boy smiled shyly at Tempe, who smiled back. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Nate nodded eagerly, and Tempe prepared him a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread. The boy ate like he was starving, which he probably was, and color returned to his cheeks with each bite. Silas watched his son come back to life, and he felt something break open in his chest. Not quite tears, but close. Relief and gratitude and shame all mixed together. That afternoon, when Nate had fallen back into healthy sleep, Silas sat with Tempe near the entrance, looking out at the white world beyond. "The storm's broken," he said. "We can get back to town tomorrow if the boy's strong enough." He should be. The walk will be hard, but the worst is past. Silence stretched between them. Then Silas spoke the words that had been building for 3 days. "I was wrong about you, about your father, about all of it." Tempe didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was soft but firm. "My father spent his whole life being told he was wrong, being dismissed, being treated like his ideas didn't matter because they didn't fit what people already believed." She looked at Silas. "I don't need you to apologize to me, but maybe you could stop telling other people they're fools just because they see the world differently than you do." It was a gentle rebuke, but it landed hard. Silas nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Another silence. Then Tempe surprised him. "You weren't entirely wrong, though. This place works, but it took everything I had to build it. The cave-in almost killed me. I've been hungry more than I've been full. There were moments I wanted to quit to take your offer to give up and let everyone be right about my father being a dreamer. But you didn't." "No, because being right about this mattered more than being comfortable. Because proving my father's science worked mattered more than proving everyone else wrong." She smiled slightly. "Though I won't lie, proving everyone else wrong feels pretty good, too." Despite everything, Silas found himself smiling back. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun set. Through the entrance, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink and purple. Tomorrow they would walk back to Thornwick Hollow. Tomorrow Silas would have to face his wife, his daughter, his town, and explain what had happened. Explain how he'd been saved by the girl he'd called a fool. But for now, in this moment, in this warm chamber carved from stone and stubbornness, Silas Marlowe allowed himself to simply be grateful. Grateful his son was alive. Grateful this impossible place existed. Grateful that in a world of certainty and answers and sold solutions, there was still room for quiet wisdom and patient earth and the dreams of men who talked to rocks. Outside, the temperature dropped again as night fell. The stars came out hard and bright and cold. Inside the earth hearth, the temperature held steady at 64 degrees, unchanged and unchanging as it had for weeks and would for months to come. The mountain breathed its warm breath, and the people sheltered in its heart slept peacefully, warm and safe, while winter raged above. Part 3. The Reckoning. The journey back to Thornwick Hollow took 4 hours. Under normal conditions, it was a walk of maybe 45 minutes. But nothing about this winter was normal. And Silas Marlowe was no longer the man who'd made the journey in the opposite direction 3 days ago. That man had been certain, unshakable, built on principles he'd never questioned. This man carried his son through chest-deep snow and carried something heavier still. The knowledge that everything he'd believed about survival, about civilization, about progress itself, had been wrong. Nate walked when he could, which wasn't often. The boy was weak from fever and lack of food, his legs unsteady. Silas carried him most of the way, and the physical burden was almost welcome. It gave him something concrete to focus on, something other than the reckoning waiting for him in town. Tempe had offered to come with them. Silas had refused. "You've done enough," he'd said. "More than enough. I can find my way from here." She nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. This next part was his burden to carry, his confession to make. She'd packed them food for the journey, sent them off with quiet efficiency, and watched from her entrance as they disappeared into the white landscape. Then she'd gone back to her warm chamber, her peaceful routine, her solitary life. She didn't know that everything was about to change. Silas emerged from the forest at the edge of Thornwick Hollow, just as the sun was setting. The town looked different. Smaller, somehow more fragile. Cabins that had seemed solid and permanent now looked like what they were, temporary shelters, desperate attempts to hold back an implacable force. Smoke rose from every chimney. The smell of burning wood heavy in the cold air. People were burning everything combustible to stay alive. The first person to see him was old Mrs. Patterson, drawing water from the community well. She dropped her bucket, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas Marlowe, is that you?" "It's me. And the boy is he. Alive. Healthy." Word spread like fire in dry grass. Within minutes, people were emerging from their cabins, staring at Silas and Nate like they were ghosts returned from the dead. Cordelia came running from Marlowe House, Letty close behind. She reached them, pulled Nate into her arms, felt his forehead, checked his breathing. Tears streaming down her face. "He's well," she kept saying. "He's actually well." "How?" Silas met her eyes. "I need to tell you something. I need to tell everyone something. But first, let's get the boy home, fed, warm. Then we'll talk. They walked through town toward their house, and people followed. Not aggressively, but with desperate curiosity. They'd all watched Silas Marlowe walk into a blizzard with a dying child. They'd assumed both were dead. And here they were, alive. More than alive, the boy looked healthy, pink-cheeked, clear-eyed. It was impossible. It demanded explanation. Inside Marlowe House, the contrast was stark. Even with the stove roaring, even with years of preparation and the best construction in the hollow, the house was losing the war with winter. The floor was cold. The walls were cold. Frost decorated the inside of windows. Nate, who'd spent 3 days in constant 64-degree warmth, shivered immediately. "Mama, why is it so cold?" Cordelia and Silas looked at each other. In that question was an entire revolution. That evening, Silas called a town meeting. It wasn't formal. There was no town hall, no official structure. Just word passed from house to house that Silas Marlowe had something to say, and would everyone who could spare the firewood please gather at the church. They came. Not everyone, some families were too low on fuel to risk leaving their stoves untended. But enough. 30, maybe 40 people bundled in every layer they owned, gathering in the church, where Reverend Clayton kept a fire burning in the pot-bellied stove. Silas stood at the front near the pulpit. He'd stood here before many times at town meetings and gatherings. He'd given speeches about preparation, about the importance of proper planning, about the superiority of modern methods over old superstitions. This would be different. He looked out at the faces watching him. Neighbors, customers, people who'd bought his lumber and his stoves and his certainty. People who were suffering through the worst winter in living memory, despite following his advice. He took a breath. Most of you know I took my son to the North Ridge 3 days ago. You probably assumed we died up there. I wouldn't have blamed you. I assumed the same thing about the Sutherland girl 2 months back. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The mention of Temperance Sutherland's name was like dropping a stone in still water. She's alive, Silas continued. Thriving, actually. In a dwelling she built herself 60 feet into the mountain using her father's geological research and her own hands. Someone laughed. A harsh, disbelieving sound. Silas didn't react. I know how it sounds. I thought the same thing. I told her she was digging her grave. I offered her work shelter, a sensible alternative. She refused. I thought she was a fool. He paused, letting the words settle. I was wrong. The church was absolutely silent now. Her dwelling maintains a constant temperature of 64 degrees with 0 fuel consumption. 0. While we're burning through cords of wood just to keep our children from freezing, she's walking around barefoot in a simple dress. While we're fighting to keep drafts out and heat in, she's living in complete, constant warmth. That's impossible, someone said. Silas recognized the voice, Henry Carver, who ran the general store. I would have said the same thing. But I've been there. I've felt it. My son was dying of lung fever in this house in front of my stove, wrapped in every blanket we owned. 3 days in her earth hearth and his fever broke. He's breathing clear. He's healthy. Silas gestured to where Nate sat with his mother. The boy looked around shyly, proof incarnate. Reverend Clayton spoke up, his voice careful. Are you saying this girl has discovered some kind of miracle? Not a miracle. Science. Her father's science. Geothermal warmth. Thermal mass. Principles he tried to explain to us 20 years ago. And we dismissed him as a dreamer. Marcus Sutherland was a good man, the Reverend said, but his head was full of city ideas that don't work in these mountains. Except they do work. Better than our ideas. Better than our stoves and our wood burning and our constant battle against the cold. Silas's voice was steady, factual. We've built our entire approach to winter on one principle: generate heat to fight the cold. She built her approach on a different principle: stop fighting. Use what the earth provides. More murmuring, louder now. Some skeptical, some curious, some outright hostile. A voice from the back. So what you're saying, we should all go dig holes in the ground like animals? I'm saying we should stop dismissing ideas just because they're different. Stop assuming we know better than the land itself. Silas looked directly at the speaker. How much firewood do you have left, Tom? The man shifted uncomfortably. Maybe a week's worth. And when that's gone, I'll burn furniture, floorboards if I have to. And then, no answer. Silas turned back to the larger group. Most of us are in the same situation. We prepared. We did everything right by conventional wisdom. And we're still losing. Because conventional wisdom is wrong. My father knew it was wrong. His father knew it. The people who lived here before any of us knew it. They built their winter shelters half underground using the earth's warmth. We forgot. We got too proud of our saws and our stoves and our civilized ways. He pulled out Marcus Sutherland's journal, held it up. Everything we need to know is in here. The science, the mathematics, the practical application. I propose we use it. Adapt our existing homes. Dig winter rooms into hillsides behind our cabins. Build what the Sutherland girl is calling hollow hearths chambers that use geothermal warmth and thermal mass instead of constant fuel burning. And who's gonna teach us? Someone asked. You. No, her. If she's willing. Silas put the journal down. I'm not asking you to take this on faith. I'm asking you to consider the evidence. My son was dying. He's alive. I spent 3 days in her earth hearth. I've seen how it works. The science is sound. The results are undeniable. Ezra Boone spoke up from his spot near the back. The old hermit rarely came to town gatherings, and his presence added weight. I've known about that warm vent for 40 years, Ezra said, his voice gravelly. Marcus Sutherland showed it to me. I thought he was crazy too, but the girl did it. She actually built what he only talked about. And if she can teach us if we're willing to learn, we might survive this winter. And every winter after, without burning ourselves into poverty. The meeting continued for another hour. Arguments for and against. Questions about practicality, safety cost. Some people were intrigued. Others were skeptical. A few were outright hostile, seeing Silas's admission as a betrayal of everything he'd stood for. But the seed was planted. The next morning, Silas made the journey back to the ridge. This time, he went prepared with proper winter gear and a clear purpose. When he reached the earth hearth, Tempe was outside checking snare lines. She saw him coming, waited. Mr. Marlowe, Miss Sutherland. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've told the town about this place, about what you've accomplished. Some believe me, some don't. But there's interest. Interest in what? In learning, in building, in surviving winter the way you're surviving it. He met her eyes. I'm a builder. I have tools, materials, men who work for me. You have knowledge, your father's research, practical experience. I'm proposing a partnership. Tempe tilted her head, studying him. What kind of partnership? You consult, teach the principles, identify suitable sites. I build, provide the labor and resources. We split any profit from families who want to pay for the service. And families who can't pay, we build for them anyway. This isn't about profit. It's about survival. Silas shifted his weight. I'm not asking you to trust me. I know I don't deserve that. But I'm asking you to consider that together we might be able to help people. Save lives. Honor your father's work. Tempe was quiet for a long moment. Then, show me your hands. Silas held them out, confused. Tempe examined them, the calluses, the scars, the rough evidence of years of physical labor. You actually work, she said. You're not just a man who tells other people what to do. I've swung a hammer since I was 10 years old. Good. Because this won't work if you're not willing to dig. Really dig. Get dirty. Do the kind of work that ruins a reputation for being civilized. Silas almost smiled. Miss Sutherland, my reputation is already ruined. I admitted in front of the whole town that a 15-year-old girl knows more about surviving winter than I do. I've got nothing left to lose. Then we have an agreement. They shook hands there in the snow outside her earth hearth and began to plan. The first hollow hearth they built wasn't for a paying customer. It was for Ezra Boone. The old hermit's cabin was falling apart, his firewood nearly gone. He'd survived 30 winters alone, but this one was beating him. When Silas and Tempe approached him with the offer, he'd simply nodded. "Been waiting for this for 40 years, he said. "About time somebody listened to the mountain." Ezra's land backed up against a hillside perfect for excavation. Tempe walked the site with her father's journal, taking measurements, reading the stone, identifying the best location. Then Silas brought his men, those willing to try anyway. 5 of them, including himself. Tempe directed. Silas executed. They dug for 2 weeks, working in shifts, following Tempe's specifications exactly. She taught them how to read the rock, how to identify stable formations, how to engineer the proper airflow. She showed them her father's calculations, explained thermal mass, and R values and geothermal principles in plain language. Some of the men were skeptical at first, but as the chamber took shape, as they felt the warm air rising from the depths, skepticism turned to wonder. By late January, Ezra's hollow hearth was complete. A chamber dug into the hillside behind his cabin, connected by a short tunnel, maintaining a constant 58 degrees with 0 fuel input. The old hermit moved his bedding into it that night and slept warmer than he had in years. Word spread. By February, 5 more families had commissioned hollow hearths. Silas's crews were working constantly, and Tempe was moving between sites, consulting, teaching, adjusting designs for different geological conditions. Not everyone participated. Reverend Clayton preached against it, calling it ungodly to burrow into the earth like animals. Some families clung to their stoves and their wood burning, trusting in the old ways, even as those ways failed them. But the evidence was mounting. Families with hollow hearths were thriving. Children were healthy. Wood consumption had dropped to almost nothing. Fires were needed only for cooking, not heating. The constant stress of staying warm had disappeared, replaced by comfortable certainty. Families without hollow hearths were suffering. 3 more children died of lung fever. Elderly residents froze in their homes. Wood supplies ran out, forcing people to burn furniture, then floorboards, then anything combustible. By March, when the worst of the winter finally broke, the divide was clear. Those who'd listened to the orphan girl and swallowed their pride were alive and healthy. Those who'd clung to conventional wisdom had paid in suffering and death. The holdouts began to convert. Spring came slowly to Cumberland Gap, reluctant and tentative. But when it came, it brought a thaw in more than just the weather. Silas's partnership with Tempe had evolved into something like friendship. He visited her earth hearth regularly, sometimes to consult on new projects, sometimes just to talk. They discussed geology and engineering and the stubborn resistance of human nature to new ideas. Cordelia and Letty came too, bringing food and company. Letty especially was fascinated by the earth hearth, by Tempe's knowledge, by the idea that a woman could understand science and engineering as well as any man. "Would you teach me," Letty asked one day, "the geology, the principles, how to read stone the way you do?" Tempe looked at the 17-year-old girl, saw genuine curiosity, real hunger for knowledge. Yes, she said simply. And so Letty Marlowe became Tempe's first real student. By summer, Thornwick Hollow had transformed. 14 families had hollow hearths. Plans were being drawn for more. The town that had mocked Marcus Sutherland's rock-gazing now studied his journals like sacred texts. But not everyone survived to see the change. In early June, on a warm evening with fireflies dancing in the forest, Ezra Boone died. He'd been old, and the hard winter had taken its toll even in warmth. But he died in his hollow hearth in comfortable warmth, surrounded by the gentle heat of the earth he'd loved. Tempe found him the next morning when he didn't answer her call. He was lying in his sleeping niche, hands folded on his chest, face peaceful. On the small table beside him was a note written in shaky script, dyed warm. First time in 50 years. Thank you for remembering what we forgot. E.B. They buried him on a hilltop overlooking the hollow with half the town in attendance. Reverend Clayton said the words, but it was Silas who gave the eulogy. Ezra Boone lived alone for 30 years because he couldn't abide the certainty of civilization. He knew there were other ways, older ways, better ways. He just didn't have the strength to prove it alone. Silas looked at Tempe standing quiet and dry-eyed. It took a 15-year-old girl with her father's journals and more courage than sense to show us what Ezra always knew. The earth provides. We just have to listen. That summer and fall, the work continued. More hollow hearths, refinements to designs, experiments with different geological formations. Tempe consulted on all of them, never charging the poor splitting profits fairly with Silas on commissioned work. She remained in her original earth hearth, refusing all offers of a house in town, of comfort, of civilization. This was her home. This warm chamber in the mountain's heart, built with her own hands from her father's dreams. Other communities heard about Thornwick Hollow and its strange winter solution. Visitors came from other hollows, other towns, wanting to learn. Some were skeptical. Some were convinced. All left with copies of Marcus Sutherland's calculations and the knowledge that there was another way. The Ashwood Method, they called it, after the hollow's original name. But the people of Thornwick knew the truth. It was the Sutherland Method. Marcus's science, Tempe's courage. A father's vision made real by a daughter's refusal to quit. Winter came again in November, and this time Thornwick Hollow was ready. 23 families had hollow hearths now. The others had stockpiled massive quantities of wood, having learned from the previous year's near disaster. The town meeting in October had been brief and practical, focused on preparation and mutual support. No one mocked the idea of earth hearths anymore. No one called Temperance Sutherland a fool. When the first snow fell in December, gentle and almost beautiful, Tempe stood at the entrance to her chamber and watched it accumulate. Behind her in town, smoke rose from chimneys, but far less than the previous year. Families were warm in their hollow hearths, burning wood only for cooking, living in harmony with the mountain's breath rather than fighting against it. She thought about her father, about all the years he'd tried to convince people to listen to the stones, about the loneliness of being right when everyone else was certain you were wrong. She thought about her mother, who defended him despite the town's whispers, who'd loved him despite his strange ways. She thought about Aunt Opal, making impossible calculations, choosing survival over sentiment. Tempe understood now in a way she hadn't at 15. Opal had done what she had to do, and in forcing Tempe out, She'd inadvertently given her the freedom to prove her father right. She thought about Silas Marlowe, who'd had the strength to admit he was wrong to swallow his pride to change. Not every man could do that. Not every man would. And she thought about herself, the girl who'd been cast out with nothing, who dug into a mountain with bleeding hands and refused to quit even when reason said she should. She'd survived. More than survived. She'd built something that would outlast her. Knowledge that would spread. Wisdom that would save lives for generations. Her father's legacy. And now hers. A voice called from down the hill. Tempe. She turned to see Letty climbing the ridge, a basket over her arm. The girl visited twice a week now, learning geology, learning engineering, learning to see the world the way Tempe did. Brought you some of Mama's bread, Letty said, slightly out of breath from the climb. And Papa wanted me to ask about the Henderson project. He says the rock formation's different from what we've dealt with before. I'll come look tomorrow. Letty nodded, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? Staying here, you could have a real house in town now. Warmth whenever you want it. People who respect you. Papa would build you anything you wanted. Tempe smiled. I have warmth whenever I want it. I have a home I built with my own hands. I have respect that I earned. She looked at her earth hearth, at the gentle steam rising from its entrance into the cold air. Why would I trade that for someone else's idea of what I should want? Letty smiled back. That's what I thought you'd say. They sat together for a while, watching the snow fall, talking about rock formations and thermal dynamics, and the stubbornness of men who thought they knew better than the earth itself. When Letty left, Tempe went back inside her chamber, lit a candle, and opened her father's journal to the last page. Below her entry from December of the previous year, she added a new one. Year 2. 23 hollow hearths built. More planned for spring. Your science has saved lives, Papa. Changed minds. Transformed a town that called you a fool into a community that honors your name. I hope wherever you are, you can see it. I hope you know it was worth it. All the mockery, all the loneliness, all the years of being right when everyone else was certain you were wrong. It was worth it. T.S. She closed the journal, extinguished the candle, and lay down in her sleeping niche. The stone was warm beneath her. The air was still and gentle. Outside, winter was settling in for another long siege. But inside, in this chamber and in 23 others scattered across the hollow, people slept in warmth and safety. The earth remembered. And finally, after all these years, people were learning to remember too. 3 years later, in the spring of 1921, a young geologist from the State University visited Thornwick Hollow. He'd heard rumors of a community that had revolutionized winter survival, using geothermal principles. He came expecting to find crude adaptations, rough approximations of scientific principles. Instead, he found a fully functioning system of Earth-integrated dwellings, designed with sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and geology. He found detailed journals documenting everything written by a geologist named Marcus Sutherland and expanded by his daughter. He found a town that had reduced winter fuel consumption by 80%, while improving survival rates and health outcomes dramatically. and he found an 18-year-old woman living in a chamber carved into stone consulting on geological surveys for communities across 3 counties, respected as an expert in a field dominated by men with university degrees. "How did you learn all this?" he asked Temperance, looking through her father's journals with something like reverence. "My father taught me to listen to stones," she said. "The mountain taught me the rest." "Would you be willing to present your findings at the university? Let us study your methods." Tempe considered. A year ago, she might have said no, might have clung to her solitude, her privacy, her small corner of proven truth. But she thought about all the other hollows, all the other communities struggling through winter, all the children who died of lung fever, all the families who burned themselves into poverty, trying to stay warm. Her father's knowledge had saved Thornwick Hollow. Maybe it could save others too. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "You credit my father, Marcus Sutherland, not me, not the university. Him, his research, his vision, his refusal to stop believing even when everyone told him he was wrong." The geologist nodded slowly. "I think we can do that." That fall, Temperance Sutherland traveled to the State University and presented her father's research to a room full of professors and students. She spoke about thermal mass and geothermal venting and the fundamental inefficiency of conventional heating. She showed them journals and calculations and practical results. Some were skeptical. Some were fascinated. All were forced to admit that this young woman from the mountains had something to teach them. The presentation made newspapers across the state. "Mountain Girl Revolutionizes Winter Survival." "Orphan's Earth Home Challenges Conventional Wisdom." "Late Geologist's Research Vindicated by Daughter's Success." Marcus Sutherland's name appeared in print not as a punchline or a cautionary tale, but as a pioneering scientist whose work had practical, life-saving applications. 20 years after his death, he was finally recognized for what he'd always been: a man who understood something important that the rest of the world had forgotten. Tempe returned to Thornwick Hollow after 2 weeks at the university. She'd been offered a position, a salary, prestige, recognition. She'd turned it all down. Her place was here in these mountains, in this chamber, carved from stone and stubbornness. This was where her father's dreams had become real. This was where she'd proven that listening to the earth was more important than following convention. This was home. She arrived back at the ridge on a cool October evening. The hollow below was dotted with steam plumes rising from hollow hearths, small signatures of warmth in the gathering dusk. 37 of them now and more planned. Silas and Cordelia were waiting at her earth hearth entrance. They'd maintained it in her absence, kept her supplies stocked, watched over the place like the treasure it was. "Welcome home," Cordelia said, embracing her. "How was the university?" Silas asked. "Full of people who think they know everything and know nothing," Tempe said. "I prefer the mountain. It's honest." Silas laughed. He was grayer now, his face more lined, but healthier than he'd been 3 years ago. Building hollow hearths had given him purpose beyond profit. It had changed him in ways that went deeper than business. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Been working on it while you were gone." He led her down the ridge to the edge of town, to a small plot of land he'd purchased the previous spring. In the center stood a simple stone monument waist high, with words carved into its face. Tempe read them and for the first time in years felt tears threaten. In memory of Marcus Sutherland, geologist and visionary. He listened to stones when no one else would listen to him. His wisdom keeps us warm. Below that, a quote from his journal. The earth remembers warmth, even when we forget how to listen. I thought, Silas said quietly, that it was time the Hollow remembered him properly, not as a fool or a dreamer, but as the man who saved us all. Tempe touched the stone, felt its coolness, its permanence. He would have liked this. I hope so. Silas paused. There's one more thing. The town council voted. They want to rename the main road. Call it Sutherland Way. If you approve. Tempe smiled through the tears she refused to let fall. I approve. That night she sat in her earth hearth, warm and safe, and wrote one final entry in her father's journal. They've built you a monument, Papa, named a street after you. The university wants to publish your research. The world is finally listening to what you tried to tell them 20 years ago. I wish you could see it. See how many lives your work has saved. How many children sleep warm because you refuse to stop believing in stones. But maybe you can see it. Maybe wherever you are, you know that you were right. That all the mockery and loneliness and dismissal was worth it. Because truth doesn't stop being true just because people refuse to believe it. You taught me to listen to the mountain. I did. And it taught me to be as patient and as stubborn and as constant as stone itself. Thank you, Papa, for everything. Your daughter, Temperance. She closed the journal, placed it carefully with the others, and sat in the warm silence of her chamber. Outside, winter was coming again. The wind was picking up. The temperature was dropping. The cycle was beginning once more. But this year, like the years before, and the years to come, Thornwick Hollow was ready. The earth breathed its warm breath. The hollow hearths glowed with gentle, constant heat. And in her chamber, carved from stone 60 feet into the mountain's heart, Temperance Sutherland, orphan builder, teacher, keeper of her father's flame, slept in peace. She was 18 years old. She had survived the impossible. She had proven the unprovable. She had honored her father's legacy and built her own. And she was warm. The mountain remembered. And so, finally, did everyone else.